Altai is one of the most visited wild regions in Russia, and it has no safety infrastructure worth mentioning. That contradiction is not an oversight. It is the defining feature of the place. 13 locations across this territory share a single characteristic. They will hurt you, frighten you, or simply refuse to let you pass. Not because of bad luck, because of geology, history, and the specific kind of negligence that turns toxic ruins into scenic routes. Start with the ground itself. 15,000 years ago, a glacial dam the size of an inland sea failed catastrophically. The water did not drain. It detonated. The resulting flood carved waves of sediment and rock that stand 15 meters tall today, frozen in place like a geological slow-motion photograph of annihilation. These earthen waves are still there, perfectly preserved, as tall as a 5-story building, and tourists walk across them without knowing what they are standing on.
Move further in, and the landscape shifts from prehistoric disaster to industrial aftermath. A red and violet desert, where heavy metals have incinerated every living thing. Alpine lakes that look like paradise, and sit directly above radon fissures in granite bedrock. A lake with no fish, not because of overfishing, but because mercury concentrations make aquatic life impossible. Abandoned Soviet mines where toxic dust still travels on the wind, decades after closure. The bureaucratic decision to classify these sites as accessible has never been reversed. The infrastructure that does exist is not protective. It is incidental. An official hiking trail runs along a ledge above a 170-meter waterfall, with nothing between the path and the drop. A road was built using prison labor. The dead are in the foundation, and the road is still in use. River rapids pull downward rather than forward, and the canyon walls offer no exit. A high plateau where snow falls in summer, and no signal reaches any device. Then there is the pass. One way down into the valley, 9 switchbacks, 800 meters of descent on unpaved road with no guardrails. The wreckage at the bottom is not metaphorical. Locals call the valley below a trap, not as folklore, but as a functional geographic description. Stay until the end. The last location explains why the name stuck. The ground here once sat beneath a flood larger than all of North America's Great Lakes combined. That is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is the measured conclusion geologists reached after mapping what they found on the floor of the Kurai steppe in Russia's Altai Mountains. And what they found changes the way you see the landscape the moment you understand it. Standing on the steppe today, you face a vast, windswept plateau, stripped almost bare of vegetation, framed by mountain ridges on every side. Then you notice the terrain is not flat. Enormous parallel ridges roll across the basin in long, even sequences, each crest rising up to 20 meters above the troughs between them, each wave stretching for hundreds of meters. They look like the surface of a frozen sea, or like the ripples a shallow river leaves in a sandy bed, except scaled up by a factor of thousands. Geologists call them diluvial ripple marks, or the bed forms of a catastrophic flood pulse. About 15,000 years ago, near the close of the last ice age, glacial ice dams impounding entire valleys in the Altai highlands failed. The failure was not gradual. Hundreds of cubic kilometers of meltwater released in hours, cascading down into the intermontane basins below at speeds that turned water into something closer to a moving wall of debris. Boulders, gravel, and sediment were carried as easily as sand. On the bed of that temporary inland sea, the current sculpted giant dunes. The same fluid dynamic process that shapes ripples in a stream, operating at a scale almost beyond comprehension. When the water drained, the dunes stayed. 15 millennia of steppe climate have done little to soften them. There are no fences around them, no interpretation panels, no designated viewpoints. Rating number 13 on any considered list of the Altai's most remarkable places,
The Kurai diluvial waves ask nothing of the visitor except attention, and repay it with the uncomfortable realization that everything underfoot is the geological obituary of a vanished glacial world. Here is a fact that stops most people mid-sentence. There is not a single plant growing on the hills of Kyzylchin, not a tuft of grass, not a patch of lichen, not one weed forcing itself through cracked earth. Nothing. And that absence is precisely what makes this place, ranked 12th on our list, so deeply unsettling.
Kyzylchin Tract sits in the Koshagach district of the Altai Republic, a few kilometers from the village of Chagan-Uzun, at roughly 2,000 meters above sea level. Locals and travelers alike call it simply Mars, and once you see it, you understand why immediately. The hills run through shades of rust, ochre, dusty lilac, and deep violet in a palette that looks digitally enhanced but is entirely natural. The cause is geochemical. Iron oxides, manganese, and a suite of other heavy metals have saturated these sedimentary layers over millions of years. The rock itself dates to the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, formed originally as marine sediment on the floor of an ancient sea. Tectonic uplift brought it to the surface, and then water and wind went to work, stripping away the softer material and exposing a chemical cross-section of the crust that resembles nothing so much as another planet. The metal concentrations in the soil are high enough that seeds either fail to germinate or die in early growth stages. Insects are almost entirely absent. Animals do not linger. On a summer afternoon, when air temperatures exceed 35 degrees Celsius and the exposed rock surface climbs considerably higher, there is nowhere to shelter, no shade, no water, no relief. The landscape exerts a physical pressure. The brain reads the color as a warning signal, and the total silence amplifies that unease into something close to dread. Tourist numbers at Kyzylchin have surged over the past decade, yet there is no safety infrastructure whatsoever. Visitors walk on chemically active rock in open sandals, breathe the dust, sit directly on the ground. A short visit carries no critical health risk, but almost no one mentions even that. Number 13 on our list works on the visitor in an entirely different register. Not the quiet chemical deadness of Kyzylchin, but the overwhelming evidence of blind physical force written permanently into the topography of an entire steppe. Number 11 on this route is one of the most photographed places in the Russian Altai, and one of the least understood. The Karakol Lakes are genuinely, almost unfairly beautiful. 7 terraced pools descending the flank of the Iolgo Massif like steps carved by a careful hand, each one a slightly different shade, from deep emerald at the top to milky turquoise at the base. Hikers plan entire trips around them. They camp at the water's edge for days. What almost none of them know is that the ground beneath those tents is exhaling radioactive gas. The geological structure under the Karakol Lakes includes an active tectonic fault running through a granite massif. Granite of this type is naturally enriched with uranium and thorium. As those elements decay, they release radon, continuously, silently, without any physical sign that anything unusual is happening. Radon is colorless, odorless, and tasteless. It is also heavier than air, which means it does not disperse upward into the atmosphere. It sinks. It collects in low-lying areas, near water, inside tents pressed against the ground, precisely the places where people sleep. Geophysical surveys in the Karakol area have recorded radon levels above standard background values. A single afternoon visit carries no measurable risk, but a multi-day camp at the lakeside changes the calculation entirely. Cumulative radiation exposure builds without any sensation, any warning, any visible consequence. There are no signs posted at the lakes, no access limits, nothing between the visitor and the hazard, except the assumption that a place this beautiful could not possibly be dangerous. That assumption is the real trap, not designed by nature, but exploited by it. The invisible threat from below now gives way to a threat above the eye line. At Akkurum, enormous boulders balance on fragile clay pedestals, and they have fallen before. Some of the boulders balanced on top of these formations weigh 15 tons, and nothing is holding them up except a crumbling column of clay and gravel. That is not a geological estimate or a worst-case projection. That is the measured, documented reality of Akkurum, a site in the Chulisman Valley of Russia's Altai region, where visitors photograph themselves standing directly beneath these structures every single day. The formations are called stone mushrooms, and the name is accurate. Hard capstone rock sits atop a narrow pedestal of softer material. The mechanism that creates them is well understood. The resistant upper layer shields the ground directly beneath it from rainfall, while everything around it erodes away. Over time, the surrounding terrain drops lower and lower, leaving the pedestal standing proud, narrow, and increasingly exposed. The silhouette that emerges looks almost sculptural, as if something intentional were at work. In the Akkurum tract, dozens of these figures of varying heights are scattered across a steep slope above the river, and the largest capstones reach weights that no reasonable person would want suspended overhead. But the physics of their formation is also the physics of their destruction. The same erosion that builds the mushroom shape never stops. Rain, wind, and temperature fluctuations shave away at the pedestal continuously, centimetre by centimetre. At some point, the base can no longer support what sits above it, and the capstone falls. This has already happened multiple times at Akkurum within living memory. Several mushrooms documented by researchers and tourists in the 90s and early 2000s are gone. The photographs still exist. The structures do not. There are no barriers around the remaining formations, no marked exclusion zones. The trail runs tourists directly along the slope that falls within the impact radius of a collapsing capstone. People touch the pedestals. They stand underneath the overhanging rock for photos. They have no immediate way of knowing, from the experience of being there, that the beautiful, strange object above them is in an advanced and irreversible stage of structural failure. The valley is quiet when you visit. The Chulisman River catches the light far below. The stone figures stand motionless across the hillside in the still air, and the whole scene has the quality of something arranged rather than formed by accident. That aesthetic calm is precisely what makes the place difficult to read correctly. Akkurum ranks 10th among the Chulisman Valley's most unsettling phenomena. Further downstream, something far less visible and far harder to photograph poses a different kind of problem entirely. Lake Cheibek Kol has no fish, no algae, no frogs, and it never has. Not because of pollution in any conventional sense, but because the bedrock beneath the water has always been saturated with cinnabar, a naturally occurring mercury sulfide mineral. Snowmelt and groundwater seep through fractures in the surrounding cliffs, leach dissolved mercury compounds along the way, and deliver them steadily into the lake. This has been happening for thousands of years. The result is a body of water chemically hostile to all aquatic life, stretched nearly 3 kilometers along a sheer rock face in the Altai Mountains, and ranked 9th among the region's most extraordinary natural sights. The lake looks pristine. The water is clear, dark green, genuinely striking. Tourists stop their vehicles, step out, sometimes splash water on their faces, or cup it in their hands. There are typically no warning signs at this stretch of road. Mercury has no smell. It causes no immediate burning sensation. It doesn't discolor the water. It simply accumulates, silently and invisibly, which is exactly what makes this place so disorienting once you understand what you're looking at. The road runs directly along the shoreline, cliff on one side, dead water a few meters away on the other. The sun reaches the lake for only a brief window around midday. For most of the day, the canyon keeps it in shadow, which deepens the unease the place already generates. About 20 kilometers away, the same story exists in an industrial form. The abandoned Aktash mining and processing facility, a Soviet-era cinnabar operation that shut down in the 1990s and has never been properly remediated. Open tailings piles, collapsing mine shafts, mercury dust carried on the wind, no fencing. Cheibek Kol is what happens when geology does this over millennia. Aktash is what happens when humans accelerate it over decades. They are neighbours, and together they make this corner of Altai one of the most quietly dangerous landscapes in the region. A traveller can walk straight into one of the most contaminated industrial sites in the Russian Altai without ever seeing a single warning sign. That is not a metaphor. That is the current reality of Aktash's abandoned mercury mines, number 8 on our list. The site sits just off the Chuya Highway in the Altai Mountains, and there is nothing, no fence, no barrier, no posted hazard notice, to separate a curious visitor from decades of uncontained toxic waste. During the Soviet era, Aktash was home to a mercury processing plant that refined cinnabar, a naturally occurring mercury sulfide ore, into metallic mercury on an industrial scale. When the facility shut down in the 1990s, following the Soviet collapse, it was simply left. No decommissioning, no environmental remediation. The infrastructure rusted in place, and the waste stayed exactly where it had been deposited. What remains is a slow-motion environmental catastrophe with no visible edge. Waste rock heaps saturated with cinnabar and mercury compounds lie open to the sky. Mine shafts and adits remain unsealed. In the dry, windy conditions typical of the Chuya Valley, toxic dust lifts off those heaps and disperses through the air. Mercury does not break down. It does not neutralize. It accumulates in soil, migrates into groundwater, and moves up through food chains in increasingly concentrated forms. The rusted processing structures, the reddish-grey spoil heaps, the collapsed shaft openings. Visually, this looks like any other post-industrial ruin. That visual ordinariness is precisely what makes Aktash dangerous. There is no dramatic signal that something is wrong. The contamination is not announced, it is ambient. And that quality, the invisibility of the threat, is the thread that connects Aktash to the next entry on our list, the dead lake of Cheibek Kol, where mercury compounds have not drifted through the air, but settled into the water itself, leaving nothing alive. Russia's tallest cascade waterfall wasn't discovered until the 1980s. That's not a historical quirk. It's a direct consequence of where it is and what surrounds it. Uchar waterfall drops 160 meters on the Chalcha River, a tributary of the Kyzylchin in Russia's Altai Mountains. The Kyzylchin cuts through the range from south to north, pinned between vertical cliff walls with no roads, no marked trails, and no infrastructure of any kind along most of its length. The waterfall didn't appear on documented expedition records until the 80s, not because no one was curious, but because getting there was simply not viable for most of human history. Number 7 on our list. The only official access route is classified as extreme. 8 kilometers along sheer rock faces above a fast glacial river. For significant stretches, the trail stops existing as a trail. Hikers move across narrow stone ledges, sometimes only a few dozen centimeters wide, gripping iron staples hammered into the cliff, or ropes left behind by previous groups. Below the ledges, a drop. Below the drop, rocks and cold water. A fall here is not a survival situation. Local guides have given one particular section an unofficial name that requires no translation: the Kamikaze Trail. The danger compounds because the cliffs above the route are actively eroding. Rockfall happens without warning, at any hour, with no seasonal pattern. There are no formal warning signs at the trailhead.
Emergency services, if called, take hours to reach the scene. At the end of this is a waterfall so loud it eliminates conversation, surrounded by a permanent mist of spray that soaks everything within dozens of meters. A few minutes there, then 8 kilometers back across the same ledges. Uchar is beauty that has constructed its own defenses, and those defenses are genuinely lethal. The road you're looking at was built on top of the people who built it. That's not a metaphor. According to survivor testimonies and regional archive material, workers who died during construction of the Old Chuya Highway in the 1930s were not always given separate burials. Their bodies were reportedly covered into the embankment itself, pressed into the foundation of the road, because stopping work for funerals was not permitted. This is not fully documented in official records. It is pieced together from indirect accounts and collected memories. But it is the reason local people call this route the Road on Bones. To understand how that became possible, you have to understand what this place was. The Chuya corridor had carried trade caravans for centuries, pack animals loaded with goods moving between Siberia, Mongolia, and China, following the river through the mountains. That ancient route still existed when Stalin's regime decided to turn it into a motorable road. Tens of thousands of Gulag prisoners were assigned to the project in the 1930s. They cut through mountain passes, blasted ledges into sheer cliffs above the Chuya River, and crossed its freezing channels with inadequate tools and minimal food rations, in conditions that survivors describe as lethal. Mortality on the construction was extremely high. The result was a road, and the road is still here. The abandoned sections of the original alignment survive in several places beside the modern asphalt highway, visible as narrow, compressed earth strips, eaten back by scree and brush. There are no memorial markers, no list of names, nothing to indicate that the ground under this particular track is different from any other hillside in the Altai. This is point number 6 on our route. It does not frighten with rockfall or rapids. It frightens with quiet, with the specific quality of silence over a place where state violence was not merely committed, but architecturally incorporated into the landscape. What happened here is not hidden in the past. It is the surface you are standing on. And ahead, the danger changes form entirely. Instead of lying beneath your feet, it hangs directly overhead. No one has ever walked out of the Mazoi Cascade. Not because of exhaustion, not because of injury, simply because there is nowhere to walk. The canyon walls rise vertically from the water's edge without a single ledge, without a single break. If you end up in the river keeps you. That absolute absence of escape is what places Mazoi in a category of its own among the world's dangerous whitewater. 17 continuous kilometers of Class 6 rapids on the Chuya River in Russia's Altai region. Class 6 being the highest grade in international whitewater classification, the point where the scale stops because language runs out. Most dangerous rapids are dangerous in a specific place, for a specific moment. Mazoi is dangerous the entire way, with no exit and no pause. Beneath the surface, the threat compounds. The boulders that choke the canyon floor are not solid obstacles. They are riddled with siphons, underwater tunnels where the current disappears into the mountain. Anything pulled into a siphon does not come back. Local rescue teams have recorded fatalities where recovery of the body was simply impossible. The equipment, the kayak, the person, retained permanently by the geology of the place. Springtime transforms the river further. Snowmelt from the surrounding peaks surges into the Chuya, multiplying its volume and force. That is precisely when the world's elite kayakers arrive. Mazoi competitions occupy a fixed place on the international extreme whitewater calendar. Even at that level, the cascade claims lives. The visual reality matches the danger. A narrow, dark slot where sunlight reaches the water only at midday, where the roar of the current drowns out shouting at close range,
where the foam runs grey rather than white, loaded with suspended stone particles. Simultaneously one of the most striking gorges in Central Asia and one of its most unforgiving. Ranked 5th among the most extreme whitewater runs on the planet. Immediately adjacent, the Old Chuya Highway traces the canyon rim. A road whose construction history carries its own grim accounting. At number 4, the Teldekpen Rapids on the Katun River, Gorny Altai. Most dangerous rivers announce themselves. The current quickens, the banks narrow, the sound builds from upstream. The Teldekpen Rapids do something different.
The basalt walls close in almost without warning, volcanic rock, black and nearly bare, squeezing the Katun to a width of around 20 meters at 2 separate points. The river does not slow to fit. It has no choice but to go down. Hydrological surveys place the depth here at approximately 70 meters. That is the height of a 20-story building, submerged and invisible beneath a surface that looks like churning grey muscle. The combination is what makes this stretch genuinely lethal rather than merely difficult. A narrow channel, immense depth, and a water mass that has nowhere to go but vertical. What emerges from that geometry are the features local guides call poganka, upwelling vortexes, essentially underwater geysers driven by circulation patterns that push water down along the walls and force it back up through the center. The physics works against every instinct a swimmer has. The harder you fight toward the surface, the longer the circulating column holds you. A loaded raft can flip in fractions of a second. Rescue from the banks is close to impossible. The walls are either sheer or absent entirely, and the current speed eliminates any realistic intervention window. Even visually, the place suppresses. Basalt absorbs light rather than reflecting it. The canyon floor stays in shadow on clear days. The noise is constant and directional, coming from everywhere at once. Guided rafting groups pass through under strict protocols, and the second Teldekpen Rapid carries a technical classification that filters out all but experienced teams. This is a trap at a single point, confined, violent, and mercifully brief. What comes next on this list is something structurally different. A trap that runs for 17 kilometers with no exit at all. A place can be legally protected precisely because it will kill you.
That is the logic behind Ukok Plateau's UNESCO status. Not just ecological rarity, but the kind of environment where a broken axle stops being an inconvenience and becomes a countdown to hypothermia. This is number 3 on our list. Ukok sits above 2,000 meters in the southernmost reach of Russia's Altai Mountains, at the junction of 4 national borders: Russia, Kazakhstan, China, and Mongolia. Getting there requires a permit from Russian border control. That restriction is not administrative formality. It is an acknowledgement that the plateau operates by rules that have nothing to do with human convenience. Below the surface lies permafrost, ground that has never fully thawed, holding cold through centuries without interruption. That frozen layer is the reason Scythian burial mounds on Ukok yielded something archaeologists almost never find: intact organic material. Textiles, tattooed skin.
Soft tissue preserved not by any deliberate technique, but simply by the earth refusing to warm up. The same permafrost that turns the plateau into a time capsule also makes it treacherous to cross. In the summer thaw, the upper layer of soil becomes saturated and unstable, a surface that swallows vehicle wheels and holds them. The weather on Ukok does not transition, it switches. A clear July afternoon can turn into a snowstorm in minutes. Temperatures drop without warning. There are no trees. The plateau sits above the tree line, which means no firewood, no windbreak, no material shelter of any kind. Mobile signal does not exist here. The nearest settlement is hundreds of kilometers away, across terrain that barely qualifies as a road. The math of survival on Ukok is brutally simple. No communication, no rescue, no heat source, and a climate that treats summer as optional. The plateau doesn't threaten dramatically. It just removes every margin for error, one by one, until there are none left. Cold and silence. Number 3 on our list ends there. Number 2 operates on a completely different principle. It kills fast, with water. Belukha Mountain does not kill most of the people who die on it. It keeps them. That distinction matters, and it is not metaphor. The north face of Belukha, known as the Akimskaya Wall, rises nearly a vertical kilometre above the shore of Lake Akimsko. Avalanches strip the face constantly, in every season, at every hour, without the kind of warning that might allow a rescue team to move in afterward. The bodies of climbers lost on that wall are, in the majority of documented cases, never recovered. The slope is too steep, the avalanche frequency too high, and the wall itself periodically buries whatever is on it under fresh accumulations of ice and snow. Some of the dead have been there for decades, frozen into the glacier, absorbed into the physical body of the mountain. Belukha stands at 4,506 meters above sea level, the highest point in the Altai range, and in all of Siberia outside the Sayan Mountains. It is number 2 on our list. The routes that approach the summit via the Akimskaya Wall carry the highest technical grade in Russian alpinism, and the accident record attached to those routes is not a statistical abstraction. It is a specific, accumulated count built over generations of attempts. Tourists camping at the lake, 3 kilometers from the base of the wall, describe the sound of ice colliding with rock ledges as something that triggers a physical reflex, a ducking of the head, even at a distance where they are in no danger at all. That involuntary response says something about what the wall communicates, even to people who are not climbing it. The Altai people have called this mountain Uchar, the three-headed one, and have considered it sacred for as long as their oral tradition reaches back. Approaching it without proper reverence is understood, in that tradition, as genuinely dangerous. What makes Belukha more than a technically difficult peak is exactly that convergence, the physical reality of a face that cannot be searched or cleaned, and the older sense that the mountain does not merely defeat climbers, but holds them. The next location on our list operates on a different scale entirely. It is not a wall above a lake, it is a road, and it begins where the pavement ends. Number 1. Kyzylchin. There is a moment, standing at the edge of that overlook in the Altai Mountains, when the mind simply refuses to process what the eyes are seeing. The valley of the Kyzylchin River lies somewhere below, several hundred meters below, a thin silver thread of water visible at the bottom of a gorge so deep it feels geological, primordial, indifferent to human presence. And connecting that overlook to the valley floor is a road, if you can call it that. 9 switchback turns, roughly 3.5 kilometers of unpaved dirt carved directly into the rock face in 1992. In places the gradient hits 70%. Not a steep hill, not a challenging descent. 70% is closer to a wall than a road, and the difference matters enormously when you are sitting behind the wheel of a loaded vehicle with the valley floor waiting beneath you. No guardrails, no asphalt, no runoff lanes. On one side, rock. On the other, open air and a drop that ends badly. The real danger is not the angle, it is the brakes. On a descent this long and this steep, a heavy vehicle will overheat its brake system before most drivers recognize what is happening. For years, the evidence sat at the bottom of the pass, the wrecked remains of vehicles whose brakes had given out somewhere in the middle of those 9 turns. Locals and experienced travelers know the protocol. First gear before the first curve, engine braking all the way down, hands off the brake pedal unless absolutely necessary. There is no alternative route into the Kyzylchin Valley by land. A ferry crossing from Lake Teletskoy operates seasonally and cannot handle heavy loads. Which means Kyzylchin is not simply a difficult road, it is the only road.
Fuel, food, medical emergencies, everything that moves in or out of the remote villages below moves through these 9 turns. That is what stops people at the overlook. Not just the view, though the view is extraordinary. It is the arithmetic of the situation. You can see the entire descent from up here, every curve, every exposure. And somewhere in that calculation, the question forms on its own. What happens if the brakes go on the way down and there is nowhere left to turn? 13 locations inside a single Russian region have quietly accumulated a death toll that most travel guides simply omit. The Altai is marketed as mountain air and pristine rivers, and both of those things are true. What is also true is that the same landscape contains a chemically dead plateau, a mercury-laced river delta, walls of rock that store unclaimed bodies, and a dirt road that functions as a final exam for drivers who did not study. The diluvial waves of the Kurai steppe look like frozen ocean swells from the air. They are not a geological curiosity. They are the direct imprint of a glacial dam failure roughly 10,000 years ago, when a trapped inland sea released in hours and remodeled the valley floor permanently. The Martian hills of Kyzylchin owe their color to oxidized minerals that simultaneously made the soil chemically incompatible with plant life. Nothing grows there. Not because of altitude, not because of drought, but because the ground itself is hostile at a molecular level. Karakol Lakes photograph beautifully, stacked in forested terraces above each other. Beneath them sits a granite fault line saturated with radon, a radioactive gas that requires no industrial accident to be dangerous. The stone mushrooms of Akkurum have been undermined by wind erosion for centuries. Each capstone is a delayed projectile. The timeline for the next fall is unknown. Lake Cheibek Kol is toxic through natural geochemistry, not pollution. Aktash mines have been leaking mercury into the surrounding ecosystem for decades after Soviet-era extraction ended, only slower and without warning signs. The trail to Uchar waterfall claims lives every season from exhaustion and misjudged terrain. The Akemskaya wall on Beluka stores the remains of climbers who did not return. Katu-Yarek Pass separates prepared drivers from unprepared ones, in a way that is not metaphorical. Respect this place the way you would respect any system that operates without concern for human error.